Hello and welcome. We're here today to talk about unionization in the worlds of esports and gaming. And while these are two kind of different topics, we can cover the entire gamut by having my lovely guests. Of course, I'm MonteCristo, and joining me are Parth, formerly longtime general manager of TSM, Phil, who, of course, is the head of the NA LCSPA right now, or I guess it's just LCSPA. Did you drop the NA actually when LEC started existing, or how do you call yourselves?
We haven't officially dropped the NA because there's a lot of other games in NA. Maybe someday we'll represent more than one game, in which
Well, I
case the
like
NA
that.
is important. So you don't want to drop it and then bring it back, right? Like just I've had to deal with the logo stuff and my team side work before, and it's just better not to change things unless you really, really are ready to.
That fair enough, fair enough. And Jessica, who is a former Activision Blizzard employee, current union organizer, and has headed up a lot of at least the kind of messaging around a better ABK to talk about unionization for Activision Blizzard. And I've worked for both of the companies that are involved in this, so exciting times. And I've worked in the esports field directly for Blizzard as a developer, or as a I should say publisher in this case when I worked on Overwatch League. So we've got a lot to talk about. So let's start before we get into kind of the tech side of things and the developer side. Let's start by talking to our esports guests, Parth and Phil, about where you think unionization exists in the esports industry, particularly for players at the moment, because player unions are complex things that have to be created as they have been in traditional sports and are going to be differing somewhat from employee unions. So, Phil, do you want to kick off where we're at right now in terms of player unionization? Because important to note that the Players Association is not technically at this point a players union.
Correct. Um, we're currently at 0 unions. If you want to have your union tracker up, 0 unions. It is complicated in the esports world. In the traditional labor world, where Jessica is working in, you have a very straightforward two-party relationship between the employer and the employees. In esports, we have this really strange tri-party system where we have the employer, which is the team, the employees, the players, and we have the developer who governs the employment space for both parties. So, as Parth can speak to, you can't do a contract without going and running it back through Riot, and Riot gets to set rules around what goes in and out of those contracts. And so, the U.S. system for unionization is really designed around a two-party system, as that's what you see in the almost every business in the country. And so navigating towards being the first union requires figuring out how do you fit our triangular system into what's normally a binary. So that's what we're working towards right now. And we have participation from all parties on it. The players, the teams, and Riot are all trying to figure out what does it look like, how does it work. Is Riot a part of it? Are they not? If they're not, what do they have to cede in terms of power and control to allow a genuine collective bargaining to go? And yeah, it's a process, but we're moving in that direction and really hopeful to be there. And hopefully, I would say in the next 18 months is sort of where I peg it on in terms of where I think we need to have runway to figure out the legal side.
So, considering that Riot actually created the Players Association and began funding it itself for a while, and then you kind of have a new board taking over as well, I would suspect that Riot is probably pretty. They're a proponent of what you're trying to do. Are they willing to cede some of that ground in your negotiations if they believe that you guys are strong enough in order to affect a unionization, considering then that relationship is primarily between you guys, if you're strong, and the teams at that point in time?
Yeah, I wasn't around when the LCS was originally franchised, and the LCS of Riot, the local North American portion of Riot, was making the decisions around the creation of it. I've always taken the creation of the PA as a sign of Riot of understanding the power dynamics that were created by giving permanent status to teams and giving them a lot more power in the space and hoping to balance that with the PA. Now, that hope I think worked out differently than, the impact was different than the intent there. And certainly didn't balance the scales in any sort of significant way initially. Uh, but I think it does come from a place of compassion, of desire of a belief in the importance of a player union and a player association. So we're working towards that with them. But I would say there's complexities, differences between the LCS Riot and Riot Global. When I say there's three parties, even within Riot, there's two parties. You always have the individual region and the global trying to govern all their systems together. So it's a complicated web to try and navigate, is what I would say. But I believe that there's good intent on all sides, and we just have to keep working hard and not take that for granted. As someone made some idiom about roads to hell involving good intent. So we're going to keep working hard and try and get there. But yeah, I believe that there's a desire to try and figure this out for everybody.
So, before we get into the actual developer side, Parth, I want to get your take on this because you have spent many years understanding this from a team perspective. And obviously, a union would allow teams to do things that they can't currently do, such as set salary caps, which are currently uncapped within the LCS. Is this something that you would have in your former position as a GM and perhaps future position on the team side as well, depending on what you choose to do? Is this something that you would welcome these negotiations in order to kind of codify the rules around contracts and team creation?
So I think it's just a different perspective because I know all of the team owners have kind of talked about like what if it kind of proceeds towards unionization, what that can mean. If you were to explore things like salary caps, what would that do to like the competitiveness of NA as a region? Because NA as a region, especially for League of Legends, is like a heavy importing region, and one of the biggest draws that we have is being able to pay high salaries. And if you take that ability away, then obviously the competitiveness is going to go down. I think the situation is super complicated because again, like Phil said, it's a relationship between the the unions with the players, the orgs, and Riot. And Riot for me has always been really confusing to work with because you have the esports side that's working in NA. You have the Riot Global that controls all of all of the esports operations across the globe, and then you also have Riot proper, and those are like three different stakeholders and what happens. And so when you're like getting into the legal side of like how does Riot set the boundaries of the contracts you're going to be working with? Who's the union going to be negotiating against? Are they going to be negotiating against which faction of Riot, or are they going to be working with us? Is it going to be a three-party system? So I think for right now, we can't say. At least I know from the org side, it's hard to tell whether it's going to be like a positive or a negative for the ecosystem. It just depends on like how those proceedings go and what kind of shakes out.
Question to both of you. Would it be helpful if Riot stepped back in this process? Because it seems like that seems to be one of the major issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly one of the pathways that you could see in how something like this is structured. I mean, Riot could depower themselves on the esports side. I think you could see a world in a future where Riot's taken this very hands-on approach to the league ecosystem, which I think has obviously had incredible benefits to to esports at large, but especially to league players. And I think that there's a world where maybe the future of the system, when you add unionization in, looks more like how European football exists, where you have a bunch of national leagues, or in this case, LCS and other leagues that operate relatively independently, but also have to feed teams into the Champions League, which has its own set of rules. And so in my mind, there's a world in the future where one of the pathways could be Riot operating mostly like the Champions League, where to get to MSI, to get to Worlds, you have to fit a couple of base criteria to seed your teams in, but otherwise the regional leagues have full autonomy to operate as they need to. And I think that sort of shift could be really powerful and freeing, and also allow for more experimentation amongst the leagues, and especially allow for labor and employer to work more straightforward in how we set up the league, because the league for North America doesn't need to look like the league in Europe or in Korea. And I think there's a lot of things that have to do specifically with labor laws in each country that do dictate and impact that. So that's one pathway. I don't think it has to be the pathway, but I think it's one, and I think it's certainly a viable and good one. Would Riot be willing to do so? I don't know, but it'd be cool.
We'll focus on the benefits of unionization after we explore the developer side. So, Jessica, I want to bring you in to talk about a lot of the issues that you've been facing as a former Activision Blizzard employee. Now, clearly, there's significant amount of stuff going on with Activision Blizzard, from their massive scandal that they faced in terms of sexual harassment and discrimination recently, to a lot of people crying out for a union. And indeed, some of this has been effective because we have seen some of the QA workers begin to unionize under the Activision Blizzard umbrella. So it does feel like it's actually moving somewhere. So why is unionization so important for developers and people who work for these developers or publishers within the video game industry?
Yeah, why it's so important in game development, I mean, to me, and I think to a lot of people that work in the industry, is that, I feel like right now the way the industry is it's kind of a revolving door. So you're going into one studio, you're like, okay, maybe they don't crunch this hard, or it's just like you're kind of guessing at the labor practices of each studio. And you could even go to like indie versus AAA, and there's crunch culture there. Wages are kind of, not great compared to like the tech space where it's the same work. You're just working on games. And, just worker protections in general, specifically in quality assurance areas, are notoriously undervalued, notoriously underpaid. They're crunched really hard. I've seen people suffer physically, mentally. They can't afford the mental benefit or like health benefits. So that's a lot of why it was really important to start organizing in the game space, because I think there's like this old world view of like, you work on video games, so you should be grateful that you work on video games, but it's just not enough, especially in these expensive locations like Santa Monica, California, Irvine. Like, you're going to need at least several roommates to even survive as an entry level or quality assurance, customer service, like those workers. And even, at our higher levels, our engineers, things like that, they also take a cut because it's like, you get to work at this company. And I think people are now realizing that that doesn't really mean a lot anymore because of the scandals going on and like how leadership responds. So it's part of like taking that voice back and giving it to the workers, because that board of directors decides everyone at the company's fate without a say in any of it. So that's all we really wanted, was a seat at the table. And the Raven QA union win is so monumental in this larger movement. I feel like it inspired a lot of people to say like, okay, well, QA can have a union. Maybe we can too.
Yeah, it's also worth noting that, especially at companies with tens of thousands of employees like Activision Blizzard, there are different expectations depending on which unit you're in. Like QA famously, overworked, as you're saying, because they're on tight deadlines to check for bugs within the game before it's launched. But on the other hand, like, I worked directly with the Overwatch team, and they had a pretty strong, like, no crunching policy overall, which, if I'm being honest, I think may have hurt the development of the game and may have lessened the success of the product, especially if we're looking at the extremely long development cycle that they had and kind of a lack of live support for Overwatch. But at the same time, it just goes to show that if you're working in certain sectors, even of the same company, there can be wildly different expectations, and there isn't kind of a bare minimum that is expected from the employees about what the work-life balance or what the proper benefits are.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I can't speak to like I think there's a lot of factors into why things are delayed, and also a lot of factors into why crunch happens, and like, why we're seeing this labor push in the games and development. But you also have to factor in, like, this company also was going through an investigation from the Department of Fair Employment and Housing from the state of California this entire time, and then was keeping employees in the dark about it. So employees were already kind of feeling like leadership wasn't listening. At the same time, they held listening sessions and were trying to like kind of, what's wrong? Like, what do you want to see changed in the company? And then it was kind of just like, okay, thanks. And then no follow-up. So we were already kind of feeling bad in that way. And then, what happened with Blitzchung happened. And then leadership's response to that. And the employees were just like, you're doing all of these things over our heads and we're suffering for it. Like, people were calling customer service and giving them like threats. And it was just a nightmare. And I think a lot of people collectively over the years just started to realize like leadership is only going to care about the bottom line. And if you want protections as a worker, you're going to have to like band together with your fellow workers and figure out what makes the most sense for your unit.
As a first step, what protections do you think are lacking among developer employees, and where would you like to see the minimum floor be set across the industry?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that I would love to see changed, even crunch culture specifically. If some people like crunch, some people feel good when they're working towards a deadline and have to put all this work in. But it's like if you are doing crunch, you should have the physical, mental benefits of, health insurance at the very least. Some people have families, and like childcare on site would be great. If we can't do that, just like anything, something, right? Like not everyone is a teen or like coming out of college, like, oh, I'm going to work on video games. A lot of people actually want to stay working in video games and don't, they want to continue. So just having that like raises, compensation benefits, a lot of times we started talking about the problems with compensation because we realized like we weren't getting our full profit sharing bonus or things like that, or it's an accumulation of a lot of exploitation that I think a lot of workers are starting to be savvy to. It's like, okay, why am I getting like more high bucks when I could be like paying for childcare?
Valid questions. I mean, I identify this with this too because I've long advocated for a union for esports broadcasters, and I think especially as more and more people like myself, I have a family now, and it's like it's basically impossible for me to work in that industry because of the lack of support or even understanding for people who have any kind of life outside of the actual job, right? So it becomes very difficult. So Phil and Parth, when we talk about these kind of, obviously it's going to be very different with professional players, especially when it comes to crunch culture, because there almost isn't a choice when we're talking about sports, professional sports athletes, or we're talking about esports players, because crunching during the season is more or less mandatory if you are going to compete at the highest level. And I think we know that from understanding what it takes for elite teams across the professional sports and esports worlds in order to compete. So I think you guys probably have a somewhat different take on that. And we're also, for the most part, at talking about people who make extremely high incomes, at least in the LCS side.
And yet, making a high income doesn't mean that you shouldn't have life balance and be able to be happy in your employment. So that's an important piece. I'd say, as Jessica said, every person is going to be different in terms of what crunch looks like. Even within esports, whether it be league or any other game, you have a wide variety even on a given team about how much a player plays solo queue or pubs or in-houses or scrims or watches replay. What your training looks like might look different to somebody else. So there's a wide variety there. But when we talk about like whether it be on the developer side or on the esports and player side, collectively bargaining, working together is about lifting the sails of everybody, right? It's something where you just have more power together. It's just logical. You can do more with more people in a unit, putting together their resources. And I think you see it across the history of labor organizing. There's a reason why for the first 100 years of labor organizing in America, every attempt to organize labor ended in the employer hiring the local police and sending them to shoot the people organizing, because it was worth it to the people who had the means of production to try and quell this, because employees are going to get more if they are working together. They're going to understand that they have more value, that Amazon setting record profits and things of that nature aren't because of a few people on a board at the top. It's because of the work being done by all the people at the at the base, creating the actual products and the services that are offered, and that those people have more have more value than is being given by default by the employer. The employer is not incentivized to give you more than they have to. And when employees come together and say, hey, like, this isn't okay, we want to have a seat at the table, and they get a seat at the table through collectively bargaining, all of a sudden they gain more. It's I rarely have I ever seen in the history of organizing someone unionize and then result in worse conditions for themselves. It just doesn't happen.
But in your case, in the case of esports, it is possible that a few players who are at the very, very top of the LCS could, in fact, see less money if a salary cap is introduced. That is that at least is a possibility on the table in terms of unionization.
Sure. In unionization, salary structures are a part in labor as well. If you're looking to, a seniority system or otherwise you see in traditional labor organizing, oftentimes you're putting in a set structure. Maybe the top few producers in in Activision Blizzard have a little less leverage because they're agreeing to be a part of the collective. There's certainly a shared part of that goes in, but also in sports, let me point out that there are many collectively bargained sports where you don't take away the highest earners. And that's a part of the collectively bargaining process, right? If you want to have the highest earners bought into the process, in the same way that you have to have the highest earning teams bought into the process, those teams, the teams that are competing for MSI and world slots regularly, they don't want to cut back their budgets. So they want to have a system that allows them to spend without being totally punished. And you're also going to have top players who are going to want the opportunity to still earn at their value. It's possible to have all those things kind of fitting into a system. You can look at the MLS where their system balances this, I think, in some ways, where you have some players who are effectively exempted from the salary cap, and allows certain teams to go and spend basically uncapped in certain situations in order to try and compete, while also still allowing for the vast majority of teams to compete under kind of a similar cap system or use those uncapped spots in a less aggressive way. So there are systems out there that exist that balance all those pieces together. And I think the notion of sort of a hard NFL salary cap or NBA where there's a hard, a max salary, those are a couple examples, but they're not the only examples out there. And our system will certainly, if we went in through this process, would develop its own way of solving the problems that are unique to our space.
Yeah, it's fair. I think one interesting aspect when we compare these unionization, I won't say pushes, because obviously with the esports side, you would only push for it if it made sense, and that's why the union hasn't been created yet. I know you're exploring those options, but there are, as we're talking about, salary cap downsides and certain agreements with Riot and with the teams that would have to come into place. But one of the differences is that, well, when we're talking in the developer side about a pool of laborers going up against what is effectively an extremely profitable publicly held company, the problem with esports is, as you noted earlier, the three-party system where the teams, I think, are the ones who are being squeezed the most right now because they are operating off of venture capital, frequently at a loss. On one side, you have the developers who do not disclose the amount of money that they make via esports marketing exercises to anybody outside of the company. So they have a very opaque monetization off of esports, despite the fact that they almost certainly know what these numbers are. And then on the other side, you have the players who are getting paid very well these days, for the most part. I don't think that many of the players are suffering as they might have 10 years ago, for example. So I want to talk to Parth and ask him, in what ways would you appreciate a union in the esports space, with the understanding that teams often are squeezed from both sides?
Well, I would say that unionization, I think there's a lot of steps that lead up to that. And I think that those steps kind of are still premature. So for example, I've actually spoken, since I left TSM, I've spoken to a lot of prospective players who've reached out to me and asked me about industry standards, like what kind of contract they should be looking at. And what I found with the core problem was that information asymmetry between negotiating between players and teams is just super high. Like most new players don't know who to ask for help, how to go into negotiations. And we keep talking about salary as the biggest point right now in the conversation, but they're giving up rights like term length, consent for trades, termination clauses, salary reductions in their contracts. And there's just not enough clarity around, even if, sure, I do believe that every esports player isn't held to the same standard as someone who's working 9 to 5, because to be a competitive player at an elite level, you do have to put in a lot more hours and a certain practice regimen. But I think there's just a lot of missing clarity between what the expectations are from the org or Riot side and what the players sign on for. And I think these are the steps that I think the PA and the players can be taking right now. For example, right now, every new player who goes into the league signs a 2 or 3 year contract. That player, for the most part, those players don't have agents. Agents don't want to sign on to them because those salaries are usually fairly small. And
in contrast, everyone being incredibly well paid in the LCS. Minimum salary in academy is California legal minimum for an exempt employee. Yeah, so it's nothing special.
But again, they don't know if they can go to the agents or lawyers, and so players coming into the scene are signing 3 year contracts without having any idea of how to read a contract or what that means. And I think that's one of the first steps that you can take on the PA side, where you can create like an information flow of like, hey, if you're signing this, make sure you at least reach out to us and do due diligence before you sign something like this. Or even like information, like I bet if you Google right now what the minimum academy salary is for LCS, I don't think you can find that answer online. You have to reach out to people, and that information just needs to be more easily accessible for you as a player coming into the ecosystem to be well informed before you can even make these decisions. So I think there's a lot of steps that you can take and a lot of benefits you can provide to a lot of the players in the ecosystem before you even go to like this final step of like unionization.
Yeah, and there's a couple programs we're working on short of unionization that work towards that, and where we can work through the developer, because again, we don't have any direct power as association. The power of unionization is you guarantee a seat at the table. You are a fair, even stakeholder. You have to agree to everything that gets done. So in our current situation, I'm more of a lobbyist. I'm a lobbyist to Riot. I'm a lobbyist to the teams and to the parties, to to our players, to take steps to better improve. One thing we can work on that we're talking about, you see CESPA and LCK working on kind of an agent certification style program that they're building. That's the thing where, how do you do it in a way that makes sense, that doesn't ostracize people trying to do good work, that actually expands the opportunities for players? In my eyes, a solution to Parth's concern there is, well, we need to have more players have representation before they look at their first contract. Can we make a system where if you create a certification where if agents participate and get certified, then teams are also agreeing to provide a list of all certified agents to players before they ever provide a contract offer. So giving, that's a step that's missing. Most players don't even know who the agents are, how to contact them. You get that in front of a person beforehand, make sure that they're getting the steps to be able to get representation. That's an important intermediary step. So, there are processes that are being looked at and considered and trying to figure out how do you work this short of unionization. But at the end of the day, if you're an employee, the only way to guarantee yourself a legitimate standing and not a listening tour, as Jessica put it, of conversation, is to unionize, to take a seat at the table, and to collectively bargain, and have to have a vote of your members to approve what goes across in terms of, your rights and responsibilities of the employer to you.
Since you guys are both, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say democracy is great in general, so.
Yeah, I mean, I am obviously in favor of these things going forward myself. It's something that I've long wanted to see in both the gaming and the esports spaces. But let's start with you, Jessica, and talk about the initial barriers that you're facing and see if there are any common grounds between the developer and the esports side. So what are the first hurdles that you're trying to overcome right now, even though, as you mentioned earlier, at least on the QA side with Activision Blizzard, it does appear to be moving forward?
Yeah, so I would probably one of the hardest hurdles is just people entering in and not knowing. And companies spend millions of dollars hiring anti-union consultants who tell them exactly what to say while skirting NLRB legalities. So they can easily run an anti-union campaign. So as you're trying to organize, you have these, they're called captive audience sessions, where only the employer is allowed to talk to the employees. Everyone else is muted. Nobody can chat. And they just pretty much say, we think it's best when the relationship between the employer and the employee is there, and they like to third party the union. But what they don't understand is the union is actually the employees. It's not a third party. It's not CWA. It's GWA. They are a union, so they know what's best for Raven QA workers. So they'll be working towards that. So the hardest hurdle is just educating people on why it matters, why it's important that you know what's in your contract, why it's important that, I feel like there's a little bit of overlap in that, having that counsel, having someone advocating for you as a player, as a person, as an employee is always, number one, the best way to have an employee make the best decision for themselves. And if you have an employee advocate, and it's funny because quality assurance is kind of like a player advocate, because you want us to scrub your game before it goes live so the players enjoy it. So it's kind of like being that advocate for other workers. And even though, this person's issue with the company is not the same as this person's, you can collectively work on both of them together. But yeah, just the hardest hurdle is just educating people on their rights. You're allowed to organize, they can't retaliate against you, but it's scary, obviously, when the business is being sued for retaliation. So it's kind of hard, right? I feel like, there are obviously different situations in this regard, but I would, there's a lot of similarities in that, just making sure people make informed choices and having that seat at the table instead of having like this board decide everything for you.
Now, on the esports side, you're not going to see the same kind of anti-union movement by the teams, right? Because in this case, again, like you state, it's kind of a three-party system, but the teams are not doing the same kind of consultancy work or interacting with the players in the same way. So what are the hurdles that you guys are facing when it comes to pushing for this union?
Yeah, I think education is one of the biggest similarities. When I came in, there was a players association that preceded my existence, right? I came in and I kind of took over a reboot, and I realized very quickly that a majority of our players didn't even know that they were a part of an association, didn't know that there was an association, didn't know what it could do for you. Now that's a huge step down from understanding what a union is, what a union does for you, what it means to be a part of a union. There's just so much education. Our country in general has gone so backwards in terms of labor organizing over the last 50 years, with every, right to work law and other piece that's kind of clawed back the labor protections that have existed since the NLRB was put into place. Those things have really set back our nation's consciousness around how you organize, why employees working together is so valuable and important, and why the notion of, let's have a personal relationship between the employer and you is not a real thing. That the union and working through, setting up your own set of leaders the same way the company sets up its own set of leaders is the way to succeed, I think, is one of the biggest education pieces. It's so hard to break down our perception that if we unionize, I'm hurting myself. That's like something that a lot of people feel like, oh, well, am I giving up a lot of things? Even though the reality of unionization is you are going to gain. Like the net gain for employees is so big when unionization occurs. There's so many rights. When I look at a player contract, when I get one of the database from a top player, and I see the amount of concessions a team gives away instantly, that a new player, if they ask for them, the team would say there's no way we could do it. Your contract's worth nothing if this is not in here. We have to have this. And a top player, they say I don't want it. The team says okay, it's gone, because the reality is a lot of that stuff isn't actually core to the business, isn't actually core to the profitability, and in fact, giving it up may actually benefit both sides in a better way. But because a corporation or company can do something and can claim some amount of territory, they will. And it's hard to educate people, especially on entry, when they're so new, when they're getting so much information fresh out of high school, in our case, oftentimes, to try and educate them to that. You need the seniority of what a union brings, which is that collective knowledge, the people who've been there for a decade, who know what it means to have gone through that first contract where you had no rights to protect yourself in the case of a trade or anything else like that, right? The people who would set up in a union the rules so that the new person who comes in is already protected, right? There's so many things there, that initial education to make sure that the people coming in feel good about it, and that the people before it starts know that they're going to benefit from doing this together, and that they can look the other people and trust that if we do this, we're going to protect each other, and that's going to be, that's going to create the best safety for us. You're not alone. You're in this together. Like that. It's just that cultural piece changing and educating is so hard, takes so much time and effort and trust building. It's just, you just can't do it overnight.
I'm going to ask a question about why people should support these efforts, because it's great that people's lives might be improved who are working for these companies with the creation of a union. But if I'm a gamer buying games from a developer, or if I'm a fan of esports, why should I give a fuck about unions, and why should I be actively supporting their creation? How does it make my experience better?
If employers aren't listening to their own employees, you can be even farther removed as a player. And if you want somebody to be in your corner, I would talk to the developers who are actively working on the game. Also, happy developers make better games just in general. So, it's kind of I know, I've actually seen that argument online. It's I just want my game. Where are the new maps? It's oh, well, if people are dying in their desks, they're obviously not working on it, right? So it's I get it. It's funny, they want their content stuff. I think a lot of it too is this, how gaming as a industry was so secretive for a while, and people didn't really know what went into making games. So they just come in with their biases. It's oh, you get to work on games, why are you complaining? But they don't understand that we would have better games, better products, if people were happier. Just
Well, I think
I don't
that's true. I just, if you look at the history of games, for people who don't understand how a lot of these developers were created, they were created as passion
know.
projects and they had certain standards. I think, if you look at the world of Blizzard prior to the Activision acquisition, there's a pretty stark difference in terms of culture. And not to say that some of the poor practices that have been revealed about Blizzard weren't happening at that time. But many developers started because a group of people got together and really wanted, had a passion for making great games. And that was the core that allowed them to connect with the fans. And if people are concerned about the way that they are trying to support themselves or live their lives and can't actually focus on those passions because of ulterior factors, it can become quite difficult to create a quality product.
Yeah, I would really follow up on that and say, like, for me as a fan, kind of growing up in esports, I always followed the players and like why they were passionate about the game and why they wanted to push their boundaries of like what they could do, right? And obviously the industry was formed around esports, and now you have Riot, who obviously wants to capitalize on the LCS and like get a higher player base and sell their products. The teams who employ players obviously have their own sponsors and internal metrics that allow them to make money, and it's become a lot more about monetization, and it's helping creating a union or helping players in some way collectively bargain for their own rights frees them up to kind of pursuing what they wanted to do in the first place, which is pursuing gaming and excelling in whatever they're doing. And I think it's just better for fans in their experiences if the players are able to focus on that and less about all of the other things that go into solving their contracts and figuring all this stuff out. It carves out a lot of the inefficiencies in the system if there are a group of people who are looking out for each other, and they can kind of focus on kind of connecting to the fans and working on their craft.
I would imagine from a GM's perspective, it would also just make it significantly easier for you to do your job, because right now it's kind of just a wild west of doing, teams can spend a theoretically infinite amount of money. It's kind of difficult to figure out how you're going to construct a roster, because there's a shifting landscape of rules. There's different rules applied to different players depending on their status. And so having some kind of floor of negotiation, I imagine, would make it at least somewhat easier to nail down a roster.
Well, I don't know if necessarily makes it easier from like the GM side, because obviously if you have a certain operational budget, if you have more information or experience in the space, then you can definitely finagle your way into a lot more favorable opportunities and knowing where you can get penalized, what the opportunity costs are. So I don't necessarily think that it's going to make it better for GMs who are experienced in the long run, because then obviously it's going to equalize things for most people. But I think it is a more fair system where it'll then force teams to come up with their own advantages that don't have to do with like exploiting players or min-maxing the system. So one example I have is like right now, teams and players and coaches don't really understand the idea of cognitive load, right? Right now there's this system where if a player overworks a bit and hits like a focus minimum, he performs worse. To recover that from that, he's told to play more solo queue. As he plays more, because that's not what's going to solve it, it increases his cognitive load, he performs worse, and then it's a circular process, right? Now what teams can do is like they will just replace the player, they'll find a new player. But if things are more equalized for people across the board, then teams have to like then invest in like, how do I help the current subset of players I have to improve? How do we invest better in coaching ecosystems? How do we carve out our own advantages in our own space? So I do think that while it does make it worse for like the talented and experienced GMs in the short term, because they've been used to exploiting the current system, this equalization does push the industry forward, because now they have to come up with new and interesting ways to propel the industry that'll actually help push the performance level of teams and players in general.
And I think Parth just advocated for guaranteed contracts in esports, which I greatly appreciate. And I do. I mean, I think it is the point though is if you can sign a player for 3 years and the second they start underperforming, you can drop them and only owe 2 weeks of termination pay. Then your incentives as a business are not aligned around building long-term success. Your incentives are aligned around assessing quick, like immediate short-term talent opportunities and moving through them as much as is needed. So when you make contracts more guaranteed, not only are you protecting the workers, but you're also changing the incentives in the workplace for the employer to become more intelligent about how they operate, how they assess their own managerial staff and talent in terms of putting people in place who can build talent and nurture talent instead of just recycle it. So I think there's a lot to be said for the constraints in any space producing a result. And when you talk about, again, that like the starting question of this, which was the person on Twitter saying just shut up and code or shut up and play, right? Like those, the reason why they should care is what Jessica said, it's a happy workplace. Like if the workplace is set up in a manner where everybody can be operating at their fullest, then you're going to get a better product at the end of the day. Like it's just that simple. Places, businesses that fall apart, like you see a million articles that come out mired in issues and problems and attrition and brain drains and things like that, and it's because they didn't set up a workplace that made the place livable for all the employees there. And at some point they did, right? They had a product, like you said, they started as a passion and people stayed because they loved it. And when that left, so did the quality of the product. And so every effort to unionize is an effort to raise the quality of the experience of the employees, to help them be better at what they're doing, to help create a better product. And that person who's on Twitter, whatever their job is, they should be taking a, what? Go you, because I need to be starting my own union right now because I shouldn't be working 40 hours a week. You know what? They work 30 hours a week in France. I could be playing more video games if I had just unionized before. I shouldn't have to work 40 hours twice to pay my bills. I should be able to do one job for a reasonable amount of time and then go and have a life.
Tragically, I find most people are just trying to spread the misery of their own condition rather than supporting the improvement of their condition. So
let this panel be a call for that shift.
Yeah, it's like, I suffered. Why should you have a good life? I don't know.
Or I am currently suffering. So
Yeah.
instead of starting the process of ending suffering for somebody, let's perpetuate it for all. And even if your life, maybe your life is worse than theirs, so you lionize it, it doesn't mean that they don't deserve to also have a better life, right?
Agreed.
So very, very interesting. Let's take a couple of questions here that have come in. Parth, going from Boeing, obviously, and I remember your very fun blog posts from your early days before you got into esports full time, because you were creating a lot of content on your own, and you actually took a very bold and admirable leap where you said, I'm going to quit Boeing and focus on this for a certain amount of time, and then you ended up getting hired by TSM, which was, I think, really, really cool. How drastic was the change from Boeing to esports in terms of grind and crunch culture?
I was at the point in my life where that's something I wanted. At Boeing, again, it's a union job. Everyone who joins Boeing joins a union. You kind of do your 40 hours a week or 80 hours for 2 weeks. Everyone there, in my entire research team, which I expected to be more people of my age, were actually people who had kids my age. So I was just looking for a more grindy culture and an industry that I really wanted. So when I joined TSM, I was sharing a room with the video guy and all the coaches and players in one house. I think you lived, ate, breathed, slept the game. I remember first year, I was not only helping coach, but I was also doing sponsorship reports at the same time at night, and then I was also in charge of all the facilities and stuff. And so it was kind of a grindy startup culture. I appreciated it at the time, but then as time went on, obviously, I had time for my own interests and my own family, so I wanted to kind of take a step back. And it's one of the reasons why I also left TSM. It's because throughout my time there, I was always doing 3 different roles, and it was always the expectation. And I'm now in my 30s. I'm an old man by esports standards, and it was just time for a change.
Yeah, I mean, I could agree with that. And for those of you who are questioning unions, one of the things that happens is that people can have longer careers so they don't burn out, and we lose good people who have a lot of experience like Parth from jobs that you would probably prefer that they stay in, so that we don't just create a bunch of highly skilled people and then lose them for stupid reasons that revolve around kind of work-life balance or payment. Let's go another question here. Phil, you did mention earlier, if you allow for a player or team to be exempt from this salary cap, wouldn't it just cause an uproar?
It's not about exemption from the salary cap. It's the system which the salary cap exists. So MLS, for this asker, is a great example. There is a salary cap. It governs everyone, and every team has, I can't remember reserve player. There's some sort of name for it. I lost it, but a couple of players basically on every team have the option to be paid outside of the salary cap. So, imagine the max salary is usually like 1.5 million or something in MLS. It's not that, but I just made it up. For these one or two players, if you want to go sign David Beckham, like the Galaxy did once upon a time, they could pay him $30 million. And even though that's more than the entire cap of the rest of their team, they can do it because they see a value proposition to try and make a play to be the best team in the league and do these things. So there are systems, and other teams were able to spend that elsewhere. Maybe another team spends it on a player who only costs $3 million, but it allows teams to make those plays. And maybe the marginal value between the 3 million and 30 million in terms of competitive performance is not worth that dollar delta, but whatever the value to the team is overall to do it is available to them. So I was giving an example of a system that exists where there's more flexibility for a team to both have a salary cap where, the vast majority of our players are not making, millions of dollars. Many of our players, we represent LCS Academy, half our players are very close to the minimum salary. And within the LCS, there's a wide range and a lot of players who are making, who are not making six figures or are making very low six figures. So, which are, good salaries in a lot of parts of the world. But again, we're also in one of the most expensive markets in the country. So it's not quite apples to apples there. So
just to push back on that a little bit, most of those players have their rent and food accounted for,
which
right?
Can also be deducted from deducted from their salaries.
Okay, fair. But I think most of the players, that is not the case. Is that true?
I would not say that's the case for most players necessarily, especially within the academy space where you can make California minimum and have part of that be your housing credit counted towards it. So if you're on California minimum and they're providing you housing, that housing can be a part of your salary effectively.
However, it is Riot's call that the academy teams have to be located in California, is it not?
Yeah, academy players are not required to be located in California either at this point because there are no stage games. So teams are flexible, but because majority of players are based out of, we use California law. The rules say that California minimums are the minimums regardless. So there isn't a COBRA incentive for people to locate all their players in like the lowest cost state in the country just to try and like minimize costs.
Fair enough. As we wrap this up, let's talk about how realistic and what the timelines are for some of these unions and how close you guys are to achieving some of these goals or seeing it, at least them start to roll out in the broader industry. Jessica, as we've noted, it's already started to happen, which was surprising. Do you think that this is going to be the start of a domino effect that goes beyond Q&A into some of the bigger developers? Where are you in the broader scope of things?
Yeah, I mean, I already think that it's kind of happening. I mean, you're seeing labor movements in every industry right now. You're seeing Amazon, Starbucks, like people are collectively realizing that we've been exploited for a long time and we should probably not do that. So I think the Raven win was super, like it was a huge symbol because they fought against a really hard anti-union campaign and won, kind of by a landslide. It was 19-3. So was super proud of them, but it also inspired the rest of the industry. It's like, okay, look, we went against this behemoth, like Activision Blizzard, giant entity, a lot of money, a lot of lawyers. And we were still able to win in the NLRB hearings twice. So I just think it's super inspiring. And you're kind of already seeing other studios and people from other studios interested in what's going on at Raven, interested in what's going on in the Better ABK movement, and kind of showing that support and solidarity there. So it sounds like conversations are happening all over the place. It's just about, having people that advocate for themselves enough to push it towards like a final goal of a full union. Because obviously like figuring out units is hard. Each one is different. So I'm going to keep pushing forward regardless, but it seems like we have a lot of steam right now.
In your anecdotal experience, has it changed people's enthusiasm significantly?
I think so. I think one of the cool things about union organizing is seeing like workers take their power back through captive audience meetings. So like the employer will hold a captive audience meeting where they're just talking at the employees, kind of like vaguely threatening organization. And I don't know if like, in the broader esports place, if they are kind of like working with you in unionizing, but I just know that like I've been worked against a lot. So it's great to see workers that are, know their rights. They're not afraid to say, legally we're allowed to organize, legally we can talk about working conditions, we can share our salary, and they don't take the intimidation tactics. So I think that's been the biggest like reason why we're seeing a lot more push, because there's people that aren't afraid and they are advocating for themselves and others. So hopefully we can keep that going.
And where are we on the esports side, Phil? Because you guys are the closest out of anyone in esports. Like, I mean, the problem with a lot of esports is the international nature of the competitions makes it very difficult. You know, you are in a way lucky because you are, you know, very, as you were talking about earlier, very focused on North America and specifically all of the players who exist within a single country. Clearly much more difficult to do that if you're dealing with a coalition of different countries in Europe or other areas in Asia, or trying to put together some sort of international union as it might take place in many other esports. So you're fortunate in a way, but it's also that there really isn't any comparable body, at least in Counter-Strike. Their Players Association has had a lot of problems. It doesn't appear to be headed towards a union as quickly as you guys are. So where would you assess your current state of affairs, and what things would make you create a union versus keeping the status quo as a players association right now?
Yeah, my belief is that we should create a union. That I don't think that there's a really valid reason not to. When you look at labor organizing, again, the fundamentals are that the players, the employees are choosing to collectively work together. And if employees, if you're doing a collective bargaining vote, you see this in traditional sports, you see in other places. If you come to a standstill and you're locked out and you can't come to a solution, sometimes the thing will disband and people go back to doing it themselves because they can't come to a resolution as a group. That happens. So I think there's no reason not to organize. There's no reason not to give yourselves a shot at collective bargaining and what you can achieve as a group. That's the number one. In terms of timing, I think before I said about 18 months. I think I still stand with that. And the logic there is, especially within sports organizing, there's a few added pieces, and every workplace has to deal with, the disruption of a potential lockout or negotiation period in the middle of their work period. For us, if you look at the timeline, there's a pretty clear window when you would want to have that stuff happen, which is after Worlds, before a new season. And realistically, there's really no possibility for us to do that ahead of this coming off season, because you also would want to basically organize and begin your negotiations months before you get to that point. Sure. So that when you get to that off season, you hopefully are close to a framework, and you don't and both sides can get to a place where everyone can play and the season happens in full. So you got to give yourself enough runway there. So that's where our goals are at. We're hopeful in the next 6 months we can figure out the legal framework, get all the parties on board with how it might work, start with some initial conversations, potentially move to a place where we could organize and unionize, but look to set our collective bargaining and set a timeline for that would work with the rest of the competitive schedule to, give ourselves a good faith window to negotiate without disrupting the calendar for everyone, which is, again, what our players want. Our players want to play. So, they want to be paid and compensated fairly. They want to have rules and contracts that are equitable and ethical, and they want to play. And so, we're trying to figure out how do you do all that? Probably about 18 months.
One thing I'll add to that is that obviously I didn't deal too much with the old person who was running the PA, but once I spoke to Phil, I think there is a lot of benefit for teams also to work together with the PA, because they do have a lot of shared interests in terms of working to help improve their ecosystem in terms of tournament format and structure on the Riot end, and like working conditions. And there's a lot of push that they can work on together with Riot. So there is a lot of incentive for the PA and the teams to work together on, and I hope those initiatives are also taking place.
Yep.
There's another great reason why fans should give a fuck about this, because it's the only way that you can actually negotiate against riots as well, if you want to improve formats and other things that people have been not so happy with, especially over the past year. You need to have some amount of leverage in order to make that happen, and some alignment of goals.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. Certainly a strange part of the three-party system where, because there's potential alignment there and potential working towards against the, or a negotiation towards getting Riot to do something, we do have those incentives. So it's less of a clear combative relationship. Yes, we have things that we need to fight on, but we also have things to fight together on. So again, it's a very strange place, and it makes my world a little bit less.
In traditional sports, you're dealing with a system where the teams own the league, and therefore they are the ones deciding the rules and the executives who are in charge of the league and the formats and everything like that. In this case, Riot is completely independent of the teams. The teams, and neither the teams nor the players have any say over who the commissioner of the league is, who is operating the league, the way the league is operated, the format of the league. It's much more difficult in order to control those things without a union.
Yeah. But I also don't get several hour sessions where my players get told all tons of anti-union lies. So, you know.
Those are fun.
All right. Do you guys have any closing comments as we wrap this up? Jessica?
Just
Parth?
thank you for having me here, and you should definitely look into organizing your workplace because democracy is great, and there's tons of resources and tools for you to do that. So.
I'll follow up with that is I think a key axiom of democracy is a well-informed electorate. And so I do want to make sure that I educate all the coaches and players about the ecosystem and make their informed decisions about how they want to join unions and what they want to do. So if anyone ever wants to reach out to me for help, feel free. As long as I don't have a conflict of interest, definitely willing to help you guys out.
I think well said by both Jessica and Parth. So I will just say, rewind and listen to the 10 seconds before instead of my part. But unions are great, and you should look into being in one if you're not.
Yeah, thank you all for your work moving all of this forward. It's very much appreciated by I think many of us in the industry. So thanks a lot, and we appreciate you watching the panel.